In 2 Kings chapter 13, we read the story of King Joash of Israel, who went to see the prophet Elisha, who was lying in bed deathly ill. The king was distressed and troubled by the impending attack of the Syrians. He wept and said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Joash repeated what Elisha had said earlier when his mentor Elijah was taken up into heaven. So Joash may have been expressing his regret of losing Elisha, the last hope of Israel. Or he may have been expressing his concern as to what might happen to Israel in view of its meager army of 10,000 chariots and 50,000 horsemen. Elisha told Joash to take a bow and some arrows and instructed him to shoot an arrow through the window toward the region of Gilead in the east that was invaded by the Syrians. Elisha held Joash's hand when he shot the arrow and said that it was the Lord's arrow of deliverance from Syria. Then Elisha told Joash to take the arrows and strike the ground. Joash struck 3 times and stopped. Elisha was visibly angry and rebuked Joash, saying, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Syria till you had destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times." Joash failed to realize the promise of a total victory over Syria for lack of faith and trust. This obscure story powerfully demonstrates how we often show our lack of faith. First, we show a lack of faith by our unwillingness to use all the resources God has given us. God promised Joash total victory over Syria and affirmed his promise symbolically by having him shoot an arrow through the window eastward. Then, when he was told to strike the ground with the remaining arrows that he had, he only struck 3 times. He didn't use all the arrows in his quiver for fear of running out of them. Often, we forfeit God's full measure of blessings when we refuse to expend all that God has already deposited in us. Just like the unfaithful servant in the parable of talents, we don't use all that God has given us because we don't think they matter much. We refuse to use them for the glory of God. Jesus fed 5,000 men because a boy was willing to give up his lunch of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he was willing to use all that he had. Let me ask you, are you willing to use all the arrows in your quiver? Are you willing to put into the hands of God all the talents and gifts He has deposited in you? Second, we show a lack of faith by our uncertainness of what God can do for us. God promised total victory over Syria, but Joash had his doubts. He was willing to settle for a few victories. He was uncertain about what Yahweh could do for his people if they turned to him and follow after him. His uncertainness about God's power limited his capacity to expect a total victory over Syria. The Bible says, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, nor his ear heavy that it cannot hear." Isaiah 59:1. One man who truly believed that God can do great things was the great missionary William Carey. He was a cobbler, but when God called him in 1792 to go to India as a missionary, he gladly went. He served in India for 41 years without a furlough. During that time, He learned several Indian languages and translated the Bible into Bengali, Oriya, Marathi, in Hindi, and Sanskrit. As an educator, he taught and founded the famous Serampur College in 1818 for training Indians for Christian ministry. He coined the statement, "Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God." He believed it and he lived it. Remember, we can only rise to the level of what we expect of God. Many times when Jesus healed the sick, he said, "Your faith has made you well." Do you trust God enough to expect great things from Him? Don't be uncertain of what God can do for you, and don't resist doing great things for God. Third, we show a lack of faith by our unpreparedness to persevere until we receive what God has purposed for us. When Joash shot the first arrow, Elisha said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, for you must strike the Syrians at Aphek till you have destroyed them." This meant that Joash needed to persevere until total destruction of Syria was achieved. But Joash showed his unpreparedness to persevere by stopping after shooting 3 arrows. He gave up too soon. Perhaps he was discouraged by what the Syrians had done to Israel during the reign of his father and grandfather, and didn't think he had any chance of destroying them. Strong faith is persistent. Calvin Coolidge said, "Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent." Jesus said, "Men always ought to pray and not lose heart." Joash was not a godly man. He did evil in the sight of God and engaged in idolatry and Baal worship. So the prophet Elisha could have condemned him for his sin of idolatry. No, instead Elisha was compassionate toward Joash and gave him a message of hope and deliverance. In so doing, Elisha prefigured the redemptive ministry of Jesus. The Bible says, "For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved." John 3:17. We can be victorious over our enemies through the power of Christ. But to avail His power, we must be willing to use all the resources God has given us. We must be certain of what God can do for us. And we must be prepared to persevere until we receive what God has purposed for us. Go now and use all the arrows in your quiver. God bless you and have a wonderful week.